I call the first speaker from proposition, Mr. Ahsan, to present his case forward. The committee may speak. The floor is yours, Mr. Ahsan.
As the only non-Sarawakian in this panel, I may not understand the plight, the injustice, the inequality and heartache felt by people here. But what I do have a good understanding of is how ethno-nationalistic sentiments that can be manipulated and then used to gaslight the population is not the way forward. Two parts to my speech then. Firstly, framing what this debate looks like. Number one, what does the rise of Sarawak nationalism look like? Three things. A, political, where there are demands for greater autonomy and political control, where it looks like more powers being devolved from the federal government. Secondly, in economic terms, where Sarawak is rich in resources like oil, gas, timber, where there's demands for more control over these resources. And thirdly, socially, right? Because there's a diverse and rich culture in Sarawak with different ethnic groups and different ethnicities and different cultures, a diverse, rich culture where there are exclusive celebrations of these identities rather than more of a national one. But it also looks like branding, where there are branding such as Sarawak for Sarawakians or Sarawak Exit, which calls for certain actions by certain groups. Secondly then, what does the time frame of this debate look like? The motion states rise. Therefore, it's hard to pinpoint a specific date, time, or event where this rise takes place. What we will do though, is we will look at the evolution of this particular nationalism and why it has transformed into something we deem regrettable. What is the burden then on both sides? On proposition, we will prove why despite the benefits of Sarawak nationalism in the past, what it is now is detrimental to the political, economical, and social landscape of Sarawak as a whole. And we will illustrate this in three arguments. Firstly, on the remnant of colonialism. Secondly, on political abuse. And thirdly, on the necessity of unity. What the opposition side then has to do is prove why this evolution has actually been something beneficial and not has been something that's transformed into something that is problematic or something that can be manipulated or used to gaslight and lie to the people. Two arguments then. Number one, on the remnant of colonial past. Three parts to this argument. Number one, on the historical context. During the British colonial rule, Sarawakians were subjected to discrimination, where there was a prioritization of colonizers over local populations. This led to the emergence of nationalistic groups, such as the Sarawak United People's Party, or the Parti Bangsa Daya Sarawak, which advocated for self-determination and independence. Now, the second part of this argument, we will concede to every single benefit that this has brought in the past. Number one, the mobilization in the West was not transferable to the East due to the significantly smaller population and a lack of infrastructure in Sarawak. But secondly, in protection of indigenous rights and resources, where there are different cultural practices and political systems. In terms of culture, there's so many different indigenous groups and languages. You have the Iban group, Daya, Kenya, Kayan, Bintulu. In the West, the lingua franca is primarily Malay. But in terms of politics then, that the governance in Sarawak at the time was decentralized and given to tribe leaders. But in the West, it's more of a centralized system by the colonizers. And lastly, the necessity for a unifying battle cry, that at the time, people needed to be motivated, people needed strength, and that is what Sarawak nationalism gave them in the past. But ladies and gentlemen, that is the past. Let me now move on to the third part of this argument. Why is it necessary to regret it now? Now, in the past, the MO of the colonizers was divide and conquer, where this contributed to the divisiveness that we see between the peninsula and the East right now, where it was exploited in terms of the differences within societies, where different groups were pitted against each other to weaken the ability to resist colonial rule. But secondly then, we have already achieved independence in 1963. Moving forward, this is something that we necessarily have to break away from, because what this divisiveness does is just stand in the way of any form of progress that we want to get and hampers all the efforts and progress that we have achieved in terms of decolonization, in terms of breaking away from our colonial masters from the past. This is something that we need to do. But also in terms of how the MA 63 was negotiated in context of decolonization itself, that the fact that we did it because we don't want to be ruled anymore, the fact that we did it to be independent, this is something that we need to do then. Second argument on political abuse, three parts again. Number one, on internal political abuse. Now, disclaimer here, we're not going to be pointing any fingers, but like realistically speaking, if you have something like nationalism, which is based off of emotions, which is based off of sentiments, this is easily scapegoated for political capital and votes, which can be manipulated by local leaders to get support, but at the end, all just empty promises which are not fulfilled upon. But then we also see a lot of rural communities making it difficult for them to understand such sentiments because they do not understand what it means to be nationalistic. But it's easy to play on these emotions then, because these are the closest emotions to them, instead of actually educating them on what they need, instead of actually educating and having conversations about tangible and concrete forms of progress that can actually be quantifiable. Second part to this argument then, externally, and this is where we see a large part of the West, many leaders in the West use Sarawak for the political advantage. Because as we have seen time and time again in elections, Sarawak is literally the kingmaker in many of these elections, where political parties use the issue of Sarawak nationalism in order to get the votes that are necessary, in order to stand in power, in order to win elections. But once elected, these parties then do not prioritize Sarawak. They just forget it, they ignore them, and they become complacent. But also secondly, in terms of historical grievances, where they use the past, and then tying it back to my first argument, the fact that they use the colonial past in order to raise these sentiments, in order to rile people up in a manner that doesn't necessarily benefit anyone but those in power for their own political gain, for political capital, that does not reach the people at the bottom, that does not benefit people in any significant way, shape or form, except make them angrier, make them more divisive, and make them feel like they're not part of a country that is unified. What is the impact of this argument then? Number one, it takes away from important political discourse, because this is an easily recyclable sentiment that allows those in power to run away from conversations that are concrete and tangible. Conversations about oil royalties, conversations about autonomy in education, conversations about equitable distribution of resources. Because this is an unquantifiable issue. There is no way we can quantify nationalism. There is no way we can put a meter onto someone and say, this is how much nationalism you have, and this is how much nationalism they have. Because at the end of the day, these are all just emotions that can be riled up and that are unable to be quantifiable in a manner that can forward discussions in the most progressive manner. And that is why we see efforts like the MA63 panel being resurrected from the dead, because in 2018 it was already set up, but recently we see it being revived. That was set up to revise the agreement and and make necessary changes if deemed to be necessary, right? Where Sabah and Sarawak Affairs Minister himself, Armizan Ali, agrees that the setting up of this panel will prevent the politicization of the issue, because this is where we can actually have technical discussions about what is it that's required, that we can revisit an agreement that was once made without maybe full knowledge, without fully informed decisions, where we can revisit and revise and make all the changes that is necessary to make sure that this happens in a more equitable manner going forward. And these are the kinds of discussions that are unable to happen when the center and when the center of all these discussions are just about emotions and nationalism and doesn't do anything for the country as a whole. But secondly then, it will show the willingness of Sarawak to actually cooperate. Because right now, when we rile up nationalism, it's easy for certain figures to put out statements that say Sarawak is unwilling to be unified and use that as a facade to deny equal treatment. On a micro level, this otherizes Sarawakians. It makes them feel like they're not part of Malaysia. It makes them feel like they're in their own bubble, in their own country, where they cannot find a common ground with those from the West. And this is something that we see time and time again, that when me and Catherine flew in here from the West, we felt like we were going to a different country, because a lot of times we feel like we are there is a large gap and there's a lot of disconnect between people in the West and the East, and things like Sarawak nationalism only perpetuate this problem and make it much more difficult to deal with moving forward, where this gap will just become even further and even worse, making it much more difficult to bridge at the end of the day. Ladies and gentlemen, you will hear the opposition claim that the progress we have seen in Sarawak is due to the rise of nationalism, but you'll see that you'll find it hard to prove why this is exclusive. Because don't be fooled, ladies and gentlemen, there is a fine line between nationalism and pride. As a Penang, when I say Penang food is the best, I don't mean it in a nationalistic manner. I mean it in a way that celebrates the uniqueness of my state. And that is something that Sarawak deserves, to be celebrated in all its beauty, uniqueness, and importance. Because that is what actually push forward discussions, and that is the fine line that leads to progress at the end of the day. Which is why it's necessary for side opposition to push forth arguments that show what is the exclusivity of nationalism, whether or not the progress that we have seen in the past and the progress that we have seen right now is due to nationalism, or is it due to bridging the gaps, or is it due to actually having the conversations that are necessary, technical conversations that are based off concrete, tangible issues that can be classified, that can be debated, that can be discussed moving forward into the future. And that is why I'm so proud to stand inside proposition. Vote for us.